They bowed, expecting punishment. Instead, they were handed cups of coffee, hot, sweet, and with milk. The air smelled of dust, salt, and something unfamiliar, roasted beans, burnt sugar, a foreign kind of warmth. August 1945. Luzon Island, the Philippines. The war had ended only days before, though no one here quite believed it. On a makeshift parade ground of packed dirt, rows of Japanese prisoners stood motionless, their uniforms in tatters, their faces burned and hollow. They had been marched for hours under the sun, past trucks loaded with American rations, past locals watching in silence. The prisoners expected ridicule, maybe violence. They had been told Americans were barbarians, men who would kill them slowly, then desecrate their bodies. Instead, at the edge of the field, an American sergeant barked an order in rough Japanese. Sit. Coffee. They hesitated. The word meant nothing to most of them. One soldier, Corporal Takashi Morimoto, thought he'd misheard. He looked down at the tin cup pressed into his hands. The liquid inside was dark and steaming. No rice, no soup, no barley tea. Just this strange, bitter smell. I thought it was a trick, Morimoto would later write. We looked for the rice, but there was none, only the smell of something bitter and sweet. The first sip shocked him. It burned his tongue, hit his throat like smoke, and left behind an aftertaste he couldn't name. He coughed. The American guard laughed, not cruelly, but as if he'd just watched someone try ice cream for the first time. Guess they never had a coffee break in Tokyo, the man said, shaking his head. Morimoto didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. Not hatred. Not triumph. Just, ordinary life. He looked around. Other prisoners sipped slowly, cautiously. One spat the drink out, thinking it was medicine. Another drained his cup in a single swallow, then stared at the bottom as if it might tell his fortune. For the first time in years, there was silence without fear. Nearby, a field kitchen hissed with steam. American cooks ladled out more coffee, white bread, and canned peaches. They worked with practiced calm, like men feeding workers at a factory, not former enemies. One of them, a boy barely 20, said to no one in particular, "Hell, they're people too." The sun climbed higher. The prisoners loosened their collars, still wary but breathing easier. For months, they had lived on a handful of rice a day, watching comrades die in ditches or jungle cages. Now, the smell of coffee filled their lungs, and something in them began to shift, not hope exactly, but a fragile kind of confusion. An interpreter arrived, speaking carefully, "You are no longer soldiers. The war is finished. You will be treated as men." The words hit harder than any blow. Some of them bowed again, out of reflex. Others didn't move at all. The idea of being treated as men was harder to accept than captivity itself. When night came, the camp filled with small, uncertain movements, men washing their faces, lying on clean straw, touching the blankets as if they might vanish. In the distance, an American guard played a harmonica. The tune was soft, meandering, like a lullaby for both sides. Morimoto couldn't sleep. He wrote on a scrap of wrapping paper he'd found. "Today, I drank something called coffee. It burned my mouth, but it felt safe. I don't know why." Across the fence, A.U.S. Corporal was doing the same, writing home by flashlight. His letter read. "Got some new prisoners today. Poor bastards looked like ghosts. We gave them coffee. They didn't know what to do with it. Can you believe that? Two men, enemies only days before, both wrote about the same cup." In official reports from the time, American officers noted the surprise of Japanese captives, how they stared at fruit, milk, and bread as though at miracles. In camps from Luzon to Honolulu to California, it was the same, exhaustion, fear, then disbelief at the strange civility of it all. The Japanese had been told that surrender meant slavery. Yet here they were, fed, clothed, allowed to rest. It didn't make sense. And that was what made it unbearable. They expected humiliation, an American lieutenant later said. What they got was humanity. But humanity, to men trained never to feel weakness, could be its own kind of wound. That night, some of them whispered prayers not to gods, but to their mothers, ashamed to be alive, grateful to still feel hunger. At dawn, the guards poured more coffee. The sky was pink over the palm trees, and the prisoners lined up in silence. When the first cup was handed out, someone, maybe Morimoto, maybe another, bowed again, lower this time. The American serving him nodded once, almost formally. For a second, they understood each other. That morning, the war ended for them. But the shame had only begun. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. In Japan, surrender meant dishonor. In America, it meant breakfast. By the second week after the surrender, the camps had settled into a strange rhythm. The barbed wire no longer looked like punishment, it looked like order. The guards moved with casual confidence, the prisoners with stiff, quiet obedience. There were no shouts, no beatings. Only the scrape of tin trays, the hum of generators, and, every morning, the smell of coffee. The Japanese soldiers didn't know what to make of it. Each day began the same way: roll call, inspection, breakfast. White bread, butter, canned fruit, and that same black drink they still couldn't stop thinking about. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takada, once a teacher from Osaka, kept a hidden notebook made from torn scraps of U.S. supply forms. In it, he wrote, "They gave us bread, coffee, sugar, things our emperor never tasted in war." I wanted to cry, but I did not know why. To Takada and his men, the Americans' generosity was more unbearable than cruelty. When a man strikes you, you know your place. But when he feeds you, it breaks the code. Some prisoners refused to eat. They lined up for rations, took the bread, and buried it in the dirt behind their barracks. Better to starve as samurai than eat as slave, one muttered. But by nightfall, hunger betrayed them. The same men were seen crouched by the fence, digging with their hands to retrieve what they'd thrown away. The Americans said nothing. The next morning, they handed out more bread. No lectures. No mockery. Just breakfast. Captain James O'Leary, a camp officer, wrote in his report. They are polite to the point of paralysis. They bow before eating, bow after, bow when they pass a guard. I don't know if they're thankful or broken. Inside the wire, the prisoners tried to reassemble a sense of military order. They cleaned their shoes with sand, held roll call by rank, even saluted the rising sun, though it was forbidden. It wasn't loyalty, it was survival. Structure kept them from collapsing into guilt. But guilt was everywhere. One afternoon, an American cook, a big man from Kansas named Joe Pritchard, saw a prisoner standing motionless by the mess tent, staring at the leftovers. Pritchard walked over, held out a tin plate. "You want more?" he asked. The man didn't understand. He just stared. Pritchard smiled and spooned out another serving anyway. The prisoner froze, then bowed so low his forehead touched the ground. "No," Pritchard said awkwardly, "you don't gotta do that." Later, that same man, his name was Corporal Kenji Sato, wrote in his journal, translated years later. "I could not look at him. He was kind. I felt smaller than the dirt I ate." American kindness, for men raised to worship loyalty above life, felt like a knife turned inward. Each act of decency cut away another layer of pride. In Tokyo, newspapers spoke of divine defeat, a phrase meant to save face. But here, under the palms and the smell of diesel fuel, defeat tasted like canned peaches and warm bread. It was confusing. Some men laughed for the first time in years. Others wept silently into their sleeves. Takada noticed that the youngest prisoners adapted first. They learned English words: "Thank you, okay, coffee." They smiled back when the guards joked. The older officers disapproved but said nothing. When one private was caught humming an American song near the laundry, his superior slapped him, not in anger, but despair. "We are ghosts," he said. "Ghosts do not sing." Still, something was changing. A new kind of hunger grew, not for food, but for understanding. Takata asked for an English book. The camp library had only a few, mostly dictionaries and Bibles. He chose both. He began writing down words: peace, liberty, mourning, mercy. Words that had no direct translation in the Japan he'd known. Across the yard, an American chaplain held Sunday service under a canvas roof. The prisoners watched from a distance. When the choir sang, "Amazing Grace," Takata whispered the words he didn't yet understand: "Was blind, but now I see." For the first time, he didn't feel hatred. He felt envy. The days passed, marked not by punishment, but by routine. Work details, hygiene inspections, rest. It felt unnatural. They had expected cruelty and instead found order and compassion. It was easier to die for the emperor than to live with the enemy's kindness. At night, the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and coffee grounds. The camp generator droned like a heartbeat. From the officer's hut came the faint sound of a phonograph, Glenn Miller's "Moonlight Serenade." The Japanese soldiers lay awake, listening. Some turned their faces to the wall. Others mouthed the melody in silence. Hiroshi Takata wrote again. "Every sip of coffee feels like surrender. And, strangely, freedom." But this was not mercy for mercy's sake. The Americans had a reason. The same compassion that shamed the prisoners was part of a larger plan, to rewire the minds of those who once saw death as honor and pity as weakness. As Takata would later learn, the war hadn't truly ended. It had only changed shape. Because the Americans weren't just feeding them. They were showing them a world they had been told didn't exist. The first thing they asked for wasn't food. It was paper. By autumn of 1945, the camps had grown quieter. The chaos of surrender was over. The men had stopped waiting for punishment that never came. Their faces filled out again, their eyes, though still hollow, no longer darted at every noise. Now they wanted to reach home, to prove, somehow, that they were still alive. When the announcement came that prisoners would be allowed to write letters, it spread through the barracks like wind through dry grass. "Kamin, Kamin," they whispered, "paper." A word they hadn't spoken in years. For soldiers who had once been forbidden to speak of defeat, the chance to write felt like permission to exist. American guards brought out boxes of supplies, thin envelopes, lined paper, pencils, even bottles of ink. The prisoners stood in line, silent, bowing as each was handed a sheet. Some men touched the paper like it was a relic. Others just stared, afraid to waste a single word. Corporal Satoshi Endo, 23, sat cross-legged in the corner of his hut. He hadn't written since his conscription. His handwriting shook. After a long pause, he began. "Mother, today I drank a strange black drink. It tasted like peace." He stopped, uncertain whether the word peace was even allowed. Around him, the barracks rustled with the quiet sound of men remembering how to feel. Some wrote to wives they didn't know were widows. Some wrote to fathers who died in air raids. A few wrote to no one at all, just to empty the war out of their chests. At night, they handed the letters to an American officer who collected them carefully, saluting each man in return. It was a small gesture, but one that made the world tilt. Weeks later, when the first reply bags came back from Japan, the prisoners lined up again, this time trembling with hope. The interpreter read the list of names aloud. Dozens. Hundreds. But most went unanswered. Only later did they learn why. Tokyo had ordered all incoming letters from enemy camps to be destroyed. The government declared them poison to the national spirit. Any soldier who wrote kindly of the Americans was accused of shameful propaganda. Most families never knew their sons were alive. An American officer, Lieutenant Harris, who managed the camp's postal section, recorded his frustration in a report. "They write with grace, humility, and a strange dignity in defeat. We could learn from them, but their own nation silences their words. Still, the prisoners kept writing. They wrote knowing the letters might vanish, because writing itself was resistance against despair. Hiroshi Takada, the lieutenant who'd once vowed never to eat American bread, became one of the most prolific letter writers. His English had improved through the camp's small library. He borrowed from the Bible, underlining phrases he liked, "Love your enemies." He wrote them into his letters, though he wasn't sure he believed them yet. "Father," he wrote. "We lost the war, but here I have found something that cannot be conquered. The Americans bow to no emperor, yet they are kind. Perhaps kindness is another kind of strength." He never learned if his father received it. Across the Pacific, the censorship continued. In Japan, the word surrender was banned from newspapers, the dead were honored as heroes, the living prisoners erased from memory. Families were told that their sons who'd been captured had ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the Americans introduced something new in the camps, a re-education program. They called it human reorientation. The idea wasn't revenge. It was reconstruction, to show their captives what democracy looked like when practiced, not preached. The prisoners attended classes where interpreters explained Western ideas, rights, freedom, individual concepts alien to men, taught that obedience was the highest virtue. They read magazines like Life and Reader's Digest, watched newsreels of New York and San Francisco. For many, it was like looking through a window into another planet. One evening, the Americans screened a film, The Grapes of Wrath. The prisoners watched in silence as poor farmers fought against hunger, injustice, and loss. When the lights came back on, one man whispered, "They suffer too." Another said, "They show their weakness, and no one kills them." That night, the camp felt different. It was the first time any of them realized that suffering wasn't exclusive to Japan. That the enemy could also bleed, doubt, and dream. Some of the older soldiers called it poison, foreign pity. But others began to see it as a kind of redemption. Endo wrote another letter, this one never mailed. "The Americans laugh loudly. They treat us as if the war was a mistake, not a sin. Maybe that is why they can start again. I wonder if we ever will." A few guards, reading over the letters during censorship checks, stopped editing. One sergeant confessed to his logbook. "I've grown to respect these men. They bow when they pass, they never complain, and when they write, they sound more human than we do." By winter, snow fell across the camp. The men wore donated blankets and wool coats. They built small shrines out of wood and wire scraps, not to pray for victory, but for forgiveness. Every day, the Americans gave them new paper. Every day, they wrote words that would never reach home. But the act of writing had changed them. The letters that never arrived had already done their work, transforming enemies into witnesses. Because they were no longer fighting America. They were fighting the ghosts of what they'd been taught to believe. And soon, the same men who once fought America would be the ones who helped rebuild Japan. One morning, instead of a whistle, they heard a radio. The sound drifted through the cold California air like something from another planet. Static first, then a burst of brass, a steady drum, a man's smooth voice singing about dreams and home. It wasn't an order, or a siren. It was Bing Crosby. The prisoners froze mid-step. Some looked up at the guard tower, thinking it might be a mistake, a signal, maybe, or a test. But the Americans didn't shout. They just let the song play. For the first time since capture, there was rhythm. That winter of 1945-46 was cold even by California standards. The barracks smelled of damp wool and smoke from the small stoves. Men huddled close at night, wrapped in donated army blankets, their breath clouding in the dark. They had learned to live with silence, it was safe, predictable, unfeeling. But that morning, silence broke. Morimoto, the same corporal who had once bowed before a cup of coffee, whispered, "Is this American war music?" The interpreter smiled faintly. "No. This is peace music. The phrase didn't make sense. Peace was supposed to be quiet, solemn, maybe holy, not this strange, joyful noise that made your foot tap before you realized it. Yet something stirred in the men. The melody crept under their skin, loosened something inside that discipline had held tight for years. By noon, the guards had tuned the radio louder. Glenn Miller this time, in the mood. Trumpets, trombones, rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat. The camp seemed to exhale. A few of the younger prisoners grinned, quickly hiding it when officers glared. Major Takata, once so proud of his command, stood rigid near the fence. He whispered to his adjutant, "This weakens them. Turn it off." But the guards didn't. And neither did the Americans care for their protests. By afternoon, someone was humming. Quietly at first. Then another joined in, just under his breath. Soon, the sound of humming spread through the yard like the smell of smoke, impossible to contain. That evening, as the sun fell behind the barracks, a guard named Sergeant Miller walked through the gate carrying an old guitar. The instrument looked battered, the varnish chipped, strings uneven. He sat on an overturned crate, strummed a few awkward chords, and began to sing. "Don't fence me in." The words drew laughter from the other guards. The prisoners didn't understand the lyrics, but they felt the irony. Miller noticed their smiles and nodded toward them. "Anyone play?" he asked, gesturing at the guitar. There was silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a hand rose. A small, quiet man stepped forward, Endo, the same soldier who once wrote about coffee tasting like peace. He bowed, took the guitar gently, adjusted the tuning pegs, and began to play a slow, haunting melody. No one spoke. The sound was fragile, but beautiful, a Japanese folk song, Sakura. The notes floated over the wire, through the cold night, over the sleeping guards' huts. When he finished, the Americans clapped softly. Miller said, "That's something." Then, after a pause, added, "Now, your turn to learn one of ours." And so it began, the first night of what they later called Music Hour. Over the following weeks, the Americans brought more instruments, a harmonica, a drum, even a broken trumpet repaired by one of the prisoners who'd been a factory worker in Nagoya. They played everything from swing to folk songs, translating nothing, but somehow understanding everything. It became part of the camp schedule, not official, but expected. After supper, when the sun bled into the horizon, men gathered outside the mess hall. Someone would tune the guitar, and a song would begin. Sometimes the guards sang, sometimes the prisoners. And sometimes, both. It was more than entertainment. It was language. The rhythm replaced words neither side could find. One American, Private Raymond Lopez, later recalled in a letter. "They used to look at us like ghosts." Then one night, one of them laughed. It was like hearing a machine start after years of silence. The Japanese officers tried to ban the gatherings. "It weakens discipline," they said. But discipline had already served its purpose, it had kept them alive. Now, music was teaching them how to live again. A translator named Nishida, once a teacher in Kyoto, told a guard, "Before, we feared the sound of sirens. Now, we wait for the sound of music." Even the Americans noticed the change. Fewer fights. Fewer illnesses. The men began to talk more, study English with curiosity, even joke. The camp felt less like a prison and more like a strange, temporary village suspended between two worlds. One cold night, after a long set of songs, Miller handed Endo a steaming cup of coffee. "Play us one more," he said. Endo smiled shyly, nodded, and began to strum. The song was half in Japanese, half in broken English, about home, about light, about not being afraid of tomorrow. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long time. That night, some of the prisoners dreamt not of battlefields or orders, but of music, of sound without command, of warmth that didn't burn. The next morning, when the radio started again, no one was surprised. They simply listened. But the Americans had one more surprise in store. They gave them work. The same hands that built rifles were now fixing tractors. By the spring of 1946, the war was a memory wrapped in dust and sunlight. The fences were still there, the guard towers too, but the mood inside the camps had changed. The music that once drifted through the mornings was now joined by another sound, the steady clang of tools, the cough of engines, the rhythm of work. The Americans called it rehabilitation through productivity. To the prisoners, it felt like something stranger, redemption through movement. At first, no one believed it. The announcement came one morning from a young lieutenant with an easy voice and a crooked grin. "Volunteers needed," he said, "for agricultural work. You'll be paid." The word "paid" echoed through the camp like thunder. Paid? Prisoners? It sounded absurd. But when they saw the trucks outside, real trucks, waiting to carry them beyond the wire, curiosity won. The first group went to a nearby farm in California's Central Valley. The field stretched for miles, golden and wet from spring rain. The air smelled of earth, diesel, and orange blossoms. For men who had only seen smoke and metal, it was intoxicating. They bent over rows of crops, sweating under the sun, their hands in the soil. Some laughed. Others cried quietly, realizing it was the first honest work they'd done that didn't serve destruction. At noon, an American farmer, sleeves rolled up and skin dark from the sun, came by with a bucket of water and bread. One prisoner, Private Ito, hesitated, unsure if he was allowed to eat. The farmer nodded. "Go on, son," he said. Ito took a sip, then whispered in halting English, "Thank you." By evening, the men were exhausted, but their eyes were alive. They returned to camp covered in dust, smelling of grass and sweat, carrying something invisible, purpose. Soon, new work details formed, not just farms, but workshops, machine sheds, even small factories. The same men who once assembled rifles were now repairing engines, fixing tractors, welding water pipes. Inside one of the larger barns converted into a repair station, Endo, the quiet guitarist, found himself working beside an American mechanic named Bill Jackson. Jackson was from Kansas, built like an oak tree, hands like stone. When Endo misaligned a piston, Jackson leaned over and said, "No, no, like this." He placed Endo's hands correctly on the wrench. Their eyes met for a moment. No words, but understanding. By the third week, they were working in rhythm, finishing each other's tasks without speaking. One day, Endo asked, "You trust me, with tool?" Jackson laughed. "Sure. The war's over, isn't it?" That sentence, simple, careless, landed like a revelation. For years, they had been told the war would never end, that surrender meant eternal shame. But here, a stranger handed him a wrench as if trust were natural. At lunch, Jackson poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, slid one across the bench. Endo hesitated again. Jackson raised his cup. "To fixing things," he said. Endo smiled. "To tomorrow." The coffee tasted the same as in the camp, bitter, strong, but now it no longer burned with humiliation. It was warm in a different way. It tasted like work. Like normalcy. Like something human returning. In the evenings, after the trucks brought them back, the men talked softly about the day, about engines, crops, and small jokes the Americans told. The guards no longer watched them with suspicion. The lines between captor and captive blurred into habit. Captain O'Leary, the same officer who'd overseen their arrival months before, wrote in his report. "They are different men now. The stiffness is gone. They laugh. Some hum while they work. I don't think they realize they're healing." By summer, over 50,000 Japanese POWs were working across the United States, from Texas farms to Utah repair yards. They earned modest wages, spent them on soap, postcards, and the occasional photograph taken by camp staff. Some sent their pay to the Red Cross, asking it to reach families back home. The American newspapers began to notice. Ex-enemies harvesting hope, one headline read. Another, from war to work, the men who laid down their guns and picked up tools. Yet the transformation wasn't just physical. The work taught them something they hadn't expected, that dignity wasn't tied to victory, but to creation. Lieutenant Takata, who once forbade his men to smile, now oversaw a team maintaining farm machinery. He wrote in his journal. "We built weapons that destroyed. Now we build machines that grow." Perhaps this is what our ancestors meant by honor. In one camp, an American foreman played the radio while they worked, jazz again, the same Glenn Miller songs that had once filled the barracks. The prisoners didn't ask for translation anymore. They just listened and worked, the rhythm of the music matching the rhythm of their tools. It became clear, this was no longer punishment. It was education. A new kind of warfare, one fought not with rifles, but with patience, trust, and shared labor. As Endo packed up his tools one evening, he glanced at the horizon, the sun melting into the fields, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. "It no longer tastes like surrender," he said softly to Takata beside him. Takata nodded. "It tastes like tomorrow." They began to understand, the Americans weren't feeding prisoners. They were rebuilding men. And when repatriation began, many didn't want to leave. They left the camp clean, bunks folded, coffee pots still warm. It was December 1946 when the first ships departed. Dawn broke cold and silent over the Pacific as thousands of Japanese prisoners of war filed toward the harbor, carrying duffel bags stitched with their prisoner numbers. Some walked fast, eager for home. Others dragged their feet, heads down, uncertain what home even meant anymore. For more than a year, these men had built a rhythm: work, coffee, music, the quiet evenings of radio and conversation. Now, suddenly, it was over. At the dock in San Francisco, Captain O'Leary stood beside his men as the POWs lined up to board. He shook hands with each one who offered. A few bowed deeply before stepping onto the gangway. Some cried. None of them expected to. One of them, Endo, the guitarist, handed O'Leary a folded piece of paper. "For you," he said in halting English. It was a sketch, a small drawing of the camp, the guard tower, and a group of men playing music under the flagpole. Beneath it, a single word: arigato. O'Leary slipped it into his jacket pocket. "No enemies," he said quietly, "only memories." As the ship's horn sounded, a hush fell. The men on deck turned to look back at the city, at the country that had once been their nightmare, then their teacher. For a long time, no one moved. Only the gulls cried overhead. When the vessel pulled away, someone below deck began to hum, the same tune they had played on the last night of music hour. Others joined in. The sound was soft, broken, but steady. It followed them out to sea. In the cabins, men sat with notebooks full of English words, sketches, and letters they'd never mailed. Many still carried small tokens, a spoon, a photograph, a pocketknife given by a guard. They held onto them like fragments of another life. Lieutenant Takata stared at the waves for hours. He had spent months trying to understand the Americans, their humor, their contradictions, their effortless humanity. Now, watching the shore fade, he whispered to himself, "They defeated us, yet they freed us." Endo sat beside him, clutching a tin mug filled with water. He smiled faintly. "Coffee tomorrow," he said. Takata nodded. "Yes. In Japan." But his voice trembled. For all their longing to return, many dreaded what awaited them. They knew the truth: Japan was starving. Cities flattened. Families scattered. And for prisoners of war, there was no welcome. In their homeland, surrender was not survival, it was disgrace. In Tokyo, officials debated what to do with returning soldiers. Those captured were considered Senjin no Haji, the shame of the army. Some would be barred from public work, others shunned by neighbors. They would come home not as survivors, but as ghosts. On board, as night fell, the men gathered near the railing. Someone began to write on a scrap of paper, passing it around so each could sign. When they finished, they left it on a table in the mess hall, weighted by a mug. It read, "You treated us like humans. Now we must learn to live like them." The Americans who later cleaned the ship found it, stained with salt water and coffee. No one threw it away. As the ship crossed the international date line, a cold rain began. The deck was slick, the air, sharp with sea salt. Endo played his guitar one last time, the strings dull from rust. The tune was neither Japanese nor American anymore, it was something in between. When Japan finally appeared on the horizon, gray and fragile under a pale sun, the men fell silent. Some cheered. Others knelt and pressed their hands to the deck, whispering prayers. But many simply stared, realizing how much smaller their homeland looked now. The docks at Uraga were quiet when they arrived. Officials in uniforms waited with clipboards and distant eyes. No bands, no flags, only the sound of ropes hitting wet wood. Each man stepped off the ship, saluted, and walked into a new kind of exile, home, but not at peace. Endo stopped for a moment before the checkpoint. He turned back to the ship, to the American flag fluttering faintly in the distance. Under his breath, he murmured, "No enemies, only memories." Then he disappeared into the fog. They were free. But not forgiven. Years later, when Japan rose from the ashes, some said it began, with a cup of coffee. By the 1950s, Tokyo was no longer rubble. The streets that once smelled of smoke now smelled of bread and roasted beans. American music played from cafes built on old bomb sites. Neon lights replaced blackout curtains. And somewhere beneath it all, under the hum of rebuilding, lingered the memory of camps far across the ocean, where defeated men had first learned the strange dignity of peace. Takashi Morimoto, once a corporal, now walked those streets in a gray suit. He had opened a small coffee stand near Shibuya Station. On the window was a hand-painted sign, "Peace Café," inspired by Camp 14. Every morning he brewed coffee exactly as he remembered from California, strong, sweet, with milk. He still used the same phrase he'd heard from an American guard a decade earlier, "hot and ready." Customers laughed, not knowing the words were from another world. He never told them about the first time he tasted it, the morning he'd thought it was poison, not kindness. But sometimes, when he poured a cup for a stranger, he smiled a little differently, as if he knew how fragile peace could be. Across Japan, others like him were doing the same. Former soldiers who had been POWs found work as teachers, farmers, and engineers. Some opened small shops, others joined the government's reconstruction programs. What united them wasn't ideology, it was perspective. They had seen defeat stripped of hatred. They had seen mercy used as strategy. And somehow, that had changed everything. One of them, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takada, wrote a memoir in 1958. It was never famous, but in it he said, "I learned democracy not from books or generals, but from the way an American sergeant poured coffee. He did not look down on me. He simply filled my cup." By the early 1960s, Japan was thriving. Factories that once made weapons now produced radios and cars. School children learned English songs. And in nearly every city, a small coffee shop appeared, a quiet ritual adopted from the very people they had once sworn to destroy. Historians would later call it the reorientation miracle. But for the men who had lived through it, it wasn't theory. It was memory, of mornings in captivity, of music, of warmth shared between supposed enemies. In one interview from 1965, a former prisoner, now a school principal in Osaka, said, "We feared the Americans would take our honor. Instead, they gave us our humanity." When U.S. officials returned to Japan during the post-war alliance talks, some were stunned to see how easily cooperation came. A few recognized familiar faces, men who had once stood behind wire fences, now sitting at conference tables, calm and confident. One even served coffee to his former guard. By the 1970s, the story of the camps had faded from most records, but their quiet legacy lived on in habits, attitudes, and a peculiar national affection for coffee. What had once been a symbol of defeat had become a symbol of civility. Morimoto, older now, still ran his cafe. One day, an American tourist walked in, noticing the small black and white photo on the wall, a group of men in uniforms, sitting on the ground, holding tin mugs. "Your father in the army?" the tourist asked. Morimoto smiled. "No," he said softly. "In the camp." The tourist didn't understand. Morimoto didn't explain. He just poured the man a cup, adding sugar and milk, just like before. When the man took a sip, Morimoto whispered in Japanese, almost to himself, "Kindness can rebuild nations." Outside, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. Tokyo was alive, unrecognizable, modern, yet shaped by memories of quiet acts in forgotten places. A generation that had once bowed in shame now stood upright, not in pride, but in peace. Empires fall by the sword. But nations rise, by kindness. They came as enemies. And left carrying the taste of peace.